Today we are looking at a case from the start of the 20th century, so sit back as we go to Australia. Patrick Kenniff was born on the 28th of September 1863. He spent his early years in Dungog, a modest farming town in the mid-north coast region of New South Wales. In the 1860s, Dungog was a small rural settlement with only a few humble houses scattered amidst the dense bush. Life there was tough, and residents had to be self-sufficient, working tirelessly to make a living from the land. Over the following years, Patrick's mother, Mary, gave birth to 7 more children, 3 boys and 4 girls. In 1891, the Kenniffs left Dungog and relocated to Springshaw, a small town in Queensland's Central Highlands region. The reason for their departure remains unclear, though it was rumoured that they moved to evade local authorities who wanted to question them about cattle theft. But in Springshaw, the Kenniff boys continued living as they had done in Dungog, walking a thin line between right and wrong. They were known for racing horses and often came under suspicion for cattle rustling and horse stealing, maintaining their family's reputation as rugged, resilient men of the land. The eldest 2, Patrick and James, were the most willful and daring of the Kenniff brothers, known for their boldness and readiness to challenge anyone who stood in their way. In 1894, Patrick and James attracted the attention of the authorities after an audacious escapade at a race meeting in the town of Charleville. Their day at the races didn't go as planned, leaving Patrick and James short of funds to repay certain debts they owed. In a desperate attempt to remedy their financial situation, they decided to steal 3 racehorses and make a swift getaway. However, their plan quickly unravelled, and as word of the theft spread, the brothers found themselves under scrutiny from local law enforcement. Although the authorities filed a case against them for theft, this did little to deter them from continuing their illicit activities. Undeterred, the Kenniffs escalated their criminal pursuits by stealing a herd of cattle. They enlisted the help of their father, affectionately known as Old Man Kenniff, to take the stolen cows into the nearby town of Roma for sale. The brothers planned to use the proceeds from this to hire a good lawyer, as Patrick and James were convinced that they could successfully defend themselves against the charges. Their confidence proved justified, as the case was ultimately dropped. They were again arrested for horse stealing in January 1895 in the small Queensland town of Tambo. However, before the authorities could secure them behind bars, they managed to escape. They then vanished back into the bush, resuming their nomadic lifestyle. It took until the 28th of February for law enforcement to finally track them down, and while they were sleeping they entered their camp. Awoken by the disturbance, Patrick attempted to flee, but a gunshot fired at his horse sent him tumbling to the ground. James's escape was equally thwarted. He collided with a tree branch and fell, making it impossible for him to get away. After their capture, the brothers were transported to the town of Roma, the administrative centre of the Maranoa region of Queensland, where they were locked up to await trial. During the court proceedings, the evidence against them proved overwhelming, and they were found guilty of horse stealing. Patrick received a 3-year sentence, while James was sentenced to 2 years behind bars. Their time in prison only intensified their disdain for structure and authority, but once released, they faced an unsettling reality. The family had lost the lease on the plot of land in Ralph Block where they had lived, as it had been terminated following the numerous complaints regarding the family's questionable activities. Without a place to live, the Kenniffs embraced a fully nomadic lifestyle. They ventured deep into the outback, slept in tents, relied on their hunting skills to secure food, and faced the many challenges that came with this rugged way of life. This existence offered them a sense of freedom, yet as they roamed the vast landscapes of Queensland, they inevitably slipped back into their old habits and continued their pattern of stock theft and living on the fringes of the law. The 30th of March 1902 was Easter Sunday. Patrick and James had set up at one of their favourite hideaways, a place called Lethbridge Pocket. They were joined by their younger brothers and father and settled into the isolated spot, nestled within the Carnarvon Ranges. With its steep slopes leading down to a hollow creek bed, the area was notoriously difficult to navigate and provided an ideal refuge for them to stay. To the Kenniffs, this rugged terrain was second nature. They knew the Carnarvon ranges like the back of their hands, and felt very much at ease there. The distance from Lethbridge Pocket to the nearest town offered a sense of security, as the miles of wilderness shielded them from prying eyes and the reach of the outside world. But the Kenniffs hadn't realised that they were being followed. 9 days earlier, an arrest warrant had been issued for James and Patrick, with Constable George Doyle assigned to bring them in. Assisting Constable Doyle was Albert Dulkey, the manager of Carnarvon Downs Station. The two men were accompanied by a skilled native Australian tracker named Sam Johnson, whose expertise made him invaluable in the search. However, among these men, only Albert Dulkey had direct experience with the Kenniffs. He and James had previously clashed in a heated altercation that had turned physical, with James coming out much worse, a humiliation he hadn't forgotten. For Albert, the feeling was mutual. He had long despised the Kenniffs for their stock thieving, and when called to help track them down, he eagerly agreed. As the three men approached Lethbridge Pocket, Sam spotted movement on the ridge across the valley. 3 heads could be seen peering over a rock. It was Patrick, James, and their younger brother, 18-year-old Tom. Sam called out to his companions, "Here they are," but the Kenniffs had already spotted the approaching posse, and following their father's teaching, they split up. Constable Doyle and Albert immediately galloped off in pursuit of James, while Sam quickly tied the pack horse to a nearby log before joining the chase. When he caught up, he found Constable George Doyle and Albert Dulkey closing in on James, who was now pinned between them, unable to escape. As the two men wrestled James off his horse, they called to Sam to fetch the handcuffs, which were stowed in a pouch on the pack horse. Leaving them to secure James Kenniff, Sam rode back to retrieve the handcuffs. However, as he rummaged through the supplies, a sudden piercing gunshot shattered the silence, and this was followed by 4 more in rapid succession. He knew the shots could have come from Constable Doyle, but what if they hadn't? Realising the danger of riding in without knowing what had happened, he made the quick decision to go and seek help. A few hours later, help arrived, but there was no sign of the Kenniffs, Constable Doyle, or Albert Dulkey. On the 4th of April, old man Kenniff was arrested, along with his 2 youngest sons, John and Thomas. It was believed that they were attempting to erase the tracks left by James and Patrick. The 3 men were then locked up in the jail in Springshaw. The police warned that Patrick and James were likely many miles away by this point, and if they had found adequate cover, capturing them could take a long time. Still, the search continued relentlessly, as authorities had no idea of the whereabouts of Constable Doyle or Albert Dulkey. Shortly after the arrest of old man Kenneth and his youngest sons, the search party came across Constable Doyle's horse, but when they checked the saddlebags, they were shocked to find charred human bones inside. They instantly surmised that these could be the remains of the 2 men, and that the brothers had probably killed them and placed their body parts in the saddlebags in order to try and hide all traces of the terrible crime. But the horse, with its horrific load, then likely escaped and wandered until it was found only 2 miles from where Constable Doyle and Albert Dulkey had tried to apprehend the Kenniffs. The search continued, and a few hours later, the search party came across the ashes from a fire, which contained burnt bones, teeth, buttons, and the remains of a body. With all the interest from the newspapers and the public, the police commissioner, Mr. Parry Ockenden, announced the gruesome find. He also revealed that his officers had found 3 small fires burning by the creek bed and bloodstains smeared on the ground. As he continued to address the press, he told of how 2 pairs of spurs had been recovered, which had been discarded on the ground, and confirmed that these had belonged to Constable Doyle and Albert Dulkey. He also told reporters that an examination of the area revealed bullet marks in the tree trunks. The commissioner then confirmed that in his opinion, the evidence suggested that Constable George Doyle and Albert Dulkey had been murdered by Patrick and James Kenniff. News of the alleged murders soon spread across Queensland, with headlines of burning and dismemberment hitting the front pages across the whole of Australia. A reward of £1,000 was offered for the capture of the 2 brothers. The search for the Kenniffs was gruelling. Those on the trail often felt they were chasing ghosts, as though the rugged landscape itself was helping to keep the brothers hidden. For nearly 100 days, Patrick and James eluded capture, until at dawn on the 23rd of June, police officers and skilled native Australian trackers discovered their camp and descended on them. They shot the pair's horses, and James was caught while fleeing. Patrick held them off as long as he could, firing warning shots from his rifle and hiding in the dense bush. Eventually, he realised he was surrounded and turned himself in. The brothers were then taken to the town of Mitchell, where they were escorted by train to Brisbane. James and Patrick Kenniff were placed in front of the City Police Court and charged with the murders of Albert Dalkey and Constable George Doyle. There was a significant turnout from the public, who wanted to catch a glimpse of these infamous bushrangers. After hearing from multiple witnesses and deciding that there was enough evidence to charge the men, Patrick and James were put in prison to await their time in court. They weren't seen again in public until November, when their trial began. Like their initial hearing, the courtroom was packed with spectators who sat anxiously awaiting what would unfold as James and Patrick were led up the stairs from the cells below. They followed the protocol of bowing to the solicitor and then sat down in their appointed seats. Mr. Edwin Lilly and Mr. Stum were appointed prosecution for the Crown. Mr. McGrath headed up the defence. Mr. Lilly started by explaining to the jury the reason why Constable Doyle and Albert Dalkey were searching for the Kenniff brothers and outlined the known movements up until Sam Johnson heard the gunshots. Mr. Lilly then shifted focus, explaining the layout of Lethbridge pockets and recounting all the events of the 30th of March 1902. He also detailed the horrific discovery made in the saddlebags and described it in grim detail. Turning to the jury, he stated that all the evidence suggested that Constable Doyle had arrested James Kenniff, and when Albert Dalkey spotted Patrick approaching over the hill, he rode after him. At that point, Mr. Lilly proposed. Patrick shot Albert Dalkey, and when Constable Doyle tried to intervene, he too met the same tragic fate. Sam Johnson was called to the witness stand, and Mr. Lilly questioned him in detail, asking him to recount the events of that day. Once Mr. Lilly finished with his questions, the witness was cross-examined by the defence. Mr. McGrath asked Sam how he knew that it was James Kenniff he saw at Lethbridge pockets, given that he had never seen a picture of him before. Sam replied that the constable told him that it was James who they were pursuing. Later, the judge asked Sam to identify the men he had seen that day, and without hesitation, he pointed to the two defendants. The medical examiner was next to testify. He described the items found in the saddlebags and confirmed that they had contained charcoal and ash bone fragments, pins, buttons, scraps of clothing and body parts. He described his careful examination of the bag's contents and said that he identified one piece of a human skull. When the judge asked if more than one skull was present, the medical examiner replied that he could not say. He went on to tell the courts that he had also found fragments of a human vertebrae and bones from the pelvis, thigh, leg, hand and toe. He said that in his opinion, these were likely from an adult male or adult males, though he could not confirm if the bones belonged to more than one person. After 3 days of testimony, the judge asked the prosecution lawyer how both prisoners could be jointly charged with the same murders. Mr. Lilly replied that the Crown would focus on the murder of Constable George Doyle, and then the prosecution rested their case. Mr. McGrath, for the defence, argued that there was insufficient evidence to proceed to the jury, pointing out that the prosecution had not fully proven Constable Doyle's death or identified the remains as his. Despite this, the judge ruled that the trial would continue. When it was the defence's turn to call witness, both Patrick and James were allowed to speak on their own behalf. What they had to say came as a shock to many. Both brothers claimed not only that they were not responsible for this horrible crime, but they hadn't been anywhere near Lethbridge's pockets on the day of the murders. They claimed that they were in fact 90 miles away on horse racing business and brought forward witnesses who supported this. When the defence had finished presenting their evidence, in his closing arguments, Mr. McGrath highlighted the circumstantial nature of the evidence and noted inconsistencies in Sam Johnson's testimony. He questioned how Sam Johnson could have seen Tom Kenniff that day, as Tom had also been seen many miles away. Following Mr. McGrath's 3.5-hour closing statement, Mr. Lilly requested a final opportunity to address the jury. He urged them to find the Kenniffs guilty, arguing that the defence had fabricated witness testimony and woven a conspiracy to bolster their innocence. He pointed to the grim evidence, the charred remains discovered in the saddlebags, and the body parts in the fire. He then asked, who else could they belong to? Following a summing up from the judge, the jury was sent out to deliberate. When they returned, each jury member individually stated their verdict. They all found Patrick and James Kenniff guilty. Patrick was asked if he had anything to say on why he shouldn't receive the death sentence. He replied, "Yes, Your Honour," then stood up and said, "I know the sentence you are going to pass, and before you do, I say I am an innocent man. I hope before I part this world, you will find I am an innocent man." When James was asked the same question, he looked straight at the judge and said, "Yes, I have, Your Honour. I wish to mention, if you will allow me to comment on your summing up of the case today, that I think you never gave us one item of justice. I have no other witness to call, except Almighty God, that I am an innocent man. He is the only one I can call upon, and that is all I have to say. I am an innocent man." Patrick and James Kenniff were then both sentenced to death. However, in a strange turn of fate, on the 1st of January 1903, James had his sentence commuted to life imprisonment. 11 days later, his brother Patrick was hanged. James Kenniff spent 12 years in prison before being released. He died on the 8th of October 1940, and in his final moments, he still maintained his innocence. When he was asked if he had in fact committed the terrible crimes of the 30th of March 1902, he replied, "I have told you before that I am an innocent man. I am as innocent as the judge who sentenced me." Over a century has passed since this sensational tragedy gripped Australia, but all these years later, there are those who still question if Patrick and James Kenniff did in fact kill Constable George Doyle and Albert Dulkey, or on the 12th of January 1903, did Australia hang an innocent man? Hello everyone, and thank you so much for listening. As usual, please leave any comments or feedback you may have, and I hope to see you all again in the next brief case.